Hi, everybody. This is Seth Apter. I am back with another mixed media mechanics class. This time, we are going to be about the gel plate, which if you follow me and you watch my demos, you know that I am overwhelmingly obsessed with. It's one of the obsessions that has lasted time. We are going to do a lot of different things today, and the class is going to be divided really into two parts loosely. The first part of the class is a little bit more educational, we'll call it. What I'm going to do is just take you through some different techniques and some products and approaches. And we're going to be working on whatever paper you want that you have. And I'll explain a little bit about that as I go. The second half is going to be a little bit more oriented toward creating art. Over the course of the first half, you're going to get reminded of some techniques that I'm sure you all know and do. And I'm hoping that there's going to be some things that you haven't done before, hadn't really thought about, or haven't done in a long time, so that when we work in the second part, you can pick and choose whatever technique, materials, layers you want in any order, and we'll all build some art together. I want to just really quickly review the supply list. I know most people who are watching, if you're going to make along, you're probably in your studio, so you can always run and get it. Or if you're watching on recording, press pause. But just so you're prepared, you're going to need a gel plate. I hope that was obvious. I did not leave that off the list, but you need a gel plate to do a gel plate class. You're going to need a brayer, and you're going to need some form of material to work on. And I was very loose. I said your choice of watercolor, book pages, printer, scrapbook, decorative, deli, cardstock, etc. Whatever you have will work. I'm going to just take you through some of my favorites. And the size of all this, it does not matter. I'm using a 6x6-inch jelly plate. It's my kind of go-to, but I also like to do it when I do a class or a demo because you can clearly see it in the video. So my paper is small, but you can use any size, and really feel free as we go to do whatever you want with the layers. So I'm often going to start a new technique or layer with a new piece of paper, so it's clear to you. But if you want to work over a layer you've already done, totally good as well. You're going to need acrylic paints, some dye sprays, dye ink sprays, some stencils, rubber stamps. I wrote rubber acrylic because I did not want to forget that, a lot of people like the acrylic, the clear stamps. So I didn't want to be, hoity-toity and say it had to be, deeply etched red rubber. We're going to use ink pads. We're going to be using both dye-based ink pads like Distress ink, and we're going to be using the solvent or permanent ink pads like StazOn or Archival. And then you're going to need some sponges and some baby wipes and maybe paper towel or cloth. The baby wipes are for technique as well as cleanup. I'm also going to let you know now in advance that there's other things I'm going to be using, but I wanted to keep the supply list relatively brief. I didn't want to make it long, and probably a lot of what I'm going to use you have. But if you don't have it, no stress. You can just watch. All right, and we are going to get started with some techniques. We're going to go through acrylic paint, lots of techniques using acrylic paint and some other supplies. Then we're going to go through the dye sprays. Then we're going to go through the ink pads, and then we're going to go through watercolor paint. Now, watercolor wasn't on the list, but I am going to use it. So I'm giving you lots of warning in case you want to grab it. But you're probably going to want to start getting your acrylic paints ready. And before we go, I wanted to give you Seth Apter's top 11 hints and tips and tricks for gel plate. So this is a keeper. This is the keeper. This is in no particular order at all, but I thought this might be a good way to start. So the first thing is just about paint. You need to learn for you and what techniques you want to find the sweet spot between too little paint and too much paint, because you're going to have a very different effect depending upon how much paint you have on. And if you're unhappy with your print, a lot of times it's because maybe there's too much paint. Most people tend to be heavy pourers. So just be aware of that. There's no right or wrong way, but you should look out for the way that works best for you. Number one. Number two, cleaning. cleaning the gel plate. So there's two parts to this. The first part is that, water cleans the gel plate. Dish soap, that kind of soap, cleans the gel plate. You can go to hand sanitizer, especially if you're having trouble to clean the gel plate. And I know, most of us have a good deal of that on hand, no pun intended now. And then my favorite way to clean it is using packing tape, because you can just create magical strips of amazingness and clean at the same time. And then my favorite way to clean the jelly plate is to not clean the jelly plate. So pretty much, although I cleaned it for today, I don't really clean mine. I will mention in parentheses that the producers of the Jelly Arts who made the original plate, they do say that if you're going to store your jelly plate for a while, you should have it stored clean. Now, I don't do that, but that's what they say. Number 3, you may get staining on your jelly plate depending upon what materials you're using. So some of what I'm using today, particularly the dyes and the dye sprays, sometimes they can leach into the jelly plate and permanently stain it. It does not affect the function of the jelly plate, but it absolutely can shift color. So if that's something that you are unhappy with, either don't use it or perhaps invest in two jelly plates, like 2 6x6s, and have one that constantly gets stained and save the other one for something more pristine. Okay, number 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Acrylic paint, it's the most popular. I am going to be using mostly Paper Artsy chalk paint. It's just my go-to. It's the effect I like. However, it is very different in terms of how it plays with the jelly plate than a more traditional paint. Say like a Golden's or even other craft paints that aren't chalky. So do know that that has a tremendous impact on pulling prints and the effects. And if you have the ability to use both paints, try them out. Just do a session. And if for some reason you absolutely love, say, the Paper Artsy paints, but you've learned that you need your paints to not dry so fast, you can mix it. Paper Artsy actually has something that you can get from Paper Artsy, but I usually use, if I'm going to mix and slow the drying time, acrylic glazing liquid, which is just one of my go-to products. I use Golden because it also turns any opaque paint into a glaze. So I use it for lots of things. You can use oil-based paint and oil-based ink. And many of us do have oil-based markers and things like that. You can use them on the plate. But what they suggest is that you don't leave them on the plate long, and certainly clean your plate. Even I would clean my plate if I use those, because they will leach in, and over time they can soften the plate. They can definitely change the impact of the plate and how it works. Do not use, and I very rarely say do not, because anything goes, I always say, try not to use glossy photo paper. Glossy photo paper 90% of the time will stick to your plate. And it's not an easy cleanup, and it's a big mess, and not the good mess. I love a hot mess, but not that kind. So it's just something better to avoid. You can absolutely cut your plate. I stopped giving numbers, but I think you're okay with that. This is probably number 8 or something. You can take a pair of scissors and cut your plate, make it smaller, shape it. I've done that. If you do it, you can just be quick and ragged, or you can really take your time. They do suggest if you cut your plate not to use a craft knife. It's just better to use a pair of scissors. Didn't quite get why, but I'm just passing that on. Oh, I always, always, always love when I use my gel plate, just have something next to me that I can like use my extra paint on my brayer and roll off, or I can have extra paper just to take a quick print, or if I'm using a stamp and ink or spray on the plate, I can just spray it on the paper next to me. Sometimes that is just about all the papers I'm using the gel plate with, but a lot of times I just like to have my journal next to me. And that's how I start all my journal pages. Oh yeah, I love this one. for people who work differently than I do. So we have a jelly plate. And one of the things about the jelly plate is that it is translucent. So there are lots of people, not myself, who will create an entire work of art in one pull. And so they're going to put their first layer on, then they're going to put their second, then they're going to put their third, fourth, fifth, sixth. They're going to pull and they're going to have a final piece of art. Always know that whatever you put on first is the top layer on your pull. So if you just, print, and then turn your jelly plate upside down, you will see what it's going to look like when you pull the print. So if you are working on placing words or colors or shapes, always know you can just lift it up and look, and you'll see what it needs. It's kind of like when you take a picture of your art along the way to try to figure out like what's missing. I don't often do that because I like the serendipity of the accident, but it's a great technique. But my last one is there are many approaches to the gel plate, and I am just teaching mine. My working on the gel plate next to someone else, we could have completely different approaches and technique and outcome. And I love them all, but I only know what I know and what I do, and that's what you're going to get today. All right, let's go, because you are all here to create. All right, so we're going to start with the gel plate, a brayer, some form of paper. I'm going to be using lots of different paper today, so rather than take you through them, I'm just going to kind of talk about each one as I pull. So right now I'm just using white watercolor paper. I'm using 140 pound, which is just the heavier. I just prefer that, unless I'm making something for collage and I want something thin. And I'm going to get some acrylic paint out. And we are just going to really start with the basics. And the basics is, like, I've never used a gel plate before. What do I do? So you get some, we're going to start with acrylic paints. You just get some acrylic paint, shake it up so you make sure it's mixed, and then you pour out on the jelly plate. I know there are people who will transfer their paint from a palette to the jelly plate. If you're more comfortable doing it that way, by all means, but always know that if you add too little, you can always add more. So err on the side of too little. You get a brayer. There's lots of different brayers. My brayer of choice is a Tim Holtz brayer, but there's lots of people who know, all different brands, soft versus hard. You can also get brayers that have texture in them. So I'm going to go ahead and I am just swiping out. I'm going to take my brayer. I'm not wasting anything here. And I'm going to start another page. Well, then that's going to be just my extra page. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to take my watercolor paper and I'm going to just place it and I'm going to burnish it. Now, depending upon the kind of paint you're using, you might have the burnish hold longer, or depending upon the effect you want, you might pull right away, or you might let this sit and linger till it really fully dries, and you're gonna get different effects. So rather than spend too much time today showing you a short pull, a medium pull, a long pull, I may do that along the way, but try that on your own because you will get different effects. The longer you wait, the more pure the pull will be, and you'll get a lot more of the paint up. So you can see, this is mostly about as pure as you can get. I got almost all of it. And that is my piece. And because I'm using the chalk paints, and because I waited for a while, this is full on dry already. Now, all that stuff there, I could go ahead and I could pull it, like with my extra piece, or I could just leave it there and let it be there for future pulls. And that's almost always my choice because I love the buildup that you get by accident. So what else can you do? Really basically, I love to take two colors and I do this often just even when I'm working directly on paper, and just place the two colors in different spots of the gel plate. And it's a different way to mix your colors. You know, I could mix on a palette, but this allows me, should I want a pretty uneven mix, to leave it like that. I tend to mix till it blends, but if I didn't, you know, I would get this relatively uneven pull. The more you mix it with your brayer, the more you get a single third color. So you can see how that gives you that variety, that variation. And that, again, is by accident, which I love. And then you also see the strip from the original pour. And I have all that there, which is going to be picked up next. So I am just going to keep these on a pile and maybe pull them and use them again, or maybe not. Now I already have some stuff on there. I'm going to clean my brayer a bit, so I don't have too much color mixing. And I'm going to show you a way to use multiple colors, but in a more consistent way. So I'm going to use a brighter color here. I'm going to put very little on. This is a translucent paint, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Mixing a little bit with the other color, but I'm okay with that because, again, for mixed media, I don't want evenness. And I'm going to take another color. This is also translucent. And you can see how I am really not making three straight lines, trying to kind of get some bleed, make it look a little bit more organic. Let's use another little bit of a brighter color. If you wanted to make this a true, say, strip of paint, then you would use a mask. So you would start by placing that there, and then you roll the brayer on so that you would have the perfect straight edge. Let that dry, move it over, roll it on so you'd have the perfect straight edge. But for me, straight edge, straight edges are overrated for me. Now I have a couple options here. So I could literally just go and pull this right now. And often I will do that, especially if I'm using paint that doesn't dry too fast. With the chalk paint, be aware that this section here is probably completely dry, so it's not going to pull that well. So what I'm going to do instead is do another technique. I mean, this is so basic, in some ways, you probably wouldn't even call it a technique, but I'm going to let the first layer dry, and then I'm going to put some contrasting color on it, and then pull the print. For me, my go-to is just, I love an off-white. I personally love the heavy cream. And I always have that around, an off-white and a very dark. It could be a black, it could be a really deep, rich blue. So I have the black and white for this kind of pull. And I'm actually going to do it on black cardstock. Because pulling on a black background is very different than pulling on a white background. And if you've never used a black or a really dark background, you may fall in love with it. It's one of my favorite things to do. So I'm going to go ahead now. I'm going to add some of that paint. I'm going to just make sure my brayer is somewhat dry so that I keep it, not completely the same color. There'll be a little mixing, but not too much. I'm going to bray her off. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull the print. I cut this to 6 by 6, so this should be a full size. So let's see what happens. And by the by, as you're building up these extra sheets, you start really getting sometimes the best work that you've done. And the reason for that is because these guys are created without overthinking. And in this kind of mixed media abstract work, overthinking is not good. And I think using the jelly plate helps you not overthink because things happen without you being able to control that. And to me, that is number one, the beauty of mixed media. All right, let's see what we got here. I can kind of, peek a little bit just to see if it's ready to be pulled, and I think it is. And this is what I end up with, which is, I think, kind of nice. And what I really love is that. I just love the bits of black peeking through. It's a completely different look. I mean, think about this. These are somewhat the same colors. It's a completely different look having the black underneath than the white. So always good to remember. I specifically did that in threes and in vertical or horizontal if you shifted it, bars, but you can add color as many as you want in any shape or form as you want. So you may often, for example, see me covering the whole thing with whatever colors I'm using. You can just have, you can create your own fun design with or without masks with many, 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 many colors. Now, there are other things you can do that are basic, but since we do have a limited time, I want to shift to, let's add something to the equation, and that something is a stencil. And stencils for me are one of the go-tos I use for the gel plate. There are thousands of different ways to stencil on a gel plate and to use your stencil. So I just have a bunch of different ones, and I'm going to kind of take you through some of my favorites. So simply, let's just go ahead and find, I'm going to use something that has some paint on it already. You don't have to, but I'm going to. And I'm going to go ahead and I am going to lay down some paint. Let's do that. Now let's do that. Let's use some gold. This is a non-metallic gold. So I'm going to roll it over the entire plate. And save some of that. And then I'm just going to place the stencil down over it. And then I'm going to place my substrate, and I'm just going to give a lot of pressure. The thinner your substrate, the better the print will be. And if it's heavy at all, you really need to dig down with your fingers. Otherwise, nothing is going to pull up from the inside of the stencil. It's very often irregular, and that's actually what I usually like. That was a pretty good regular one. If you want to make it irregular, then what you're going to do is you're going to lay it down and swipe inconsistently and for not as long as I did. So I got that. But what else do I have? Well, I can pull this up, and now I got that. I mean, come on, peeps, right? So let's work on black one more time. And I'm thinking that this is probably dry. It's not fully dry. Let's just do it without, okay, let's just do it this way. There's a couple approaches. So I can just go ahead and pull a print, and especially if I've used non-chalk paint, this should still be pretty wet. Yeah, and I got that. Which I kind of think is kind of fun. But wait, there's more. So you can see on the gel plate, there is still a shadow. When you pull more than one directly from the same layer, you're getting a ghost print. We're not going to do a ghost print now because this is, for me, fully dry, but we're going to go back in. Going to go back in with some agave, this sort of green, bright green. And let's just layer over this. And then we'll be ready to pull a print. And I'm going to pull it on black one more time. Please notice as you're doing this, if you find that you are having too much paint every time you pour, just really be aware of that so that you can adjust. And if you are conscious of that throughout this whole class, maybe by the end of it, you'll have a really good sense of how much is just enough for you. So let's see what we get here. Okay, and we got that, which you can see has a very soft, subtle effect, but it's clearly there. And then it also has some other colors, which is, again, why I never clean my gel plate. That's going to be my favorite part. Plus, it has a little bit of the black coming through. So from that little bit of stencil, I have this, I have this, and I have this. So really 3 completely different effects, which is one of the fun things to, I always say, if you're going to buy a product, use it in every way possible so you get your money's worth. All right, so what else can we do with a stencil? A minute ago, what I did was I layered paint, put the stencil down, and pulled the print. So how about if we start with the stencil? So I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to use a different stencil. I'm going to put the stencil down first. And then let's use a sort of a gray, a bluish gray. I'm going to pour some out. I may need more, I may need less, we'll see. And I'm just going to go ahead and layer that out. Now, I could pull a print right now, but I want to make sure that all this great stuff stays on the plate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the stencil, and I'm not going to use the jelly plate for this. I'm just going to turn the stencil over, and I'm going to burnish it onto another piece of paper. Again, using the chalk paint, this is probably already a little dry. If I had a paint that didn't dry as fast, this would really be pretty wet and juicy still. But I love the soft effects. Whenever I create, I'm always trying to create as if it's a wall in Italy or Mexico that's been there 200 years, painted over and over and weathered. That's what I'm going for always. And that's why I love the chalk paints. So that's just going to give me a little. If you had a wetter paint, it would have given you a lot. This little is what I want. Because if I had done that as a layer along the way, it would have just added just a hint of mark making and interest in a way that was completely, again, out of my control. All right, so now we have that. So let's work that, what's on the plate. And I'm going to go with, let's go with a sort of a brighter turquoise-ish sea color. I'm going to shake it up, layer it out. Layer it on. I'm gonna sprayer some of it off. I think I'm gonna pull the print on white. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, we got that. So that's going to have lots of different layers. It's going to have the paint. It's going to have the stencil. It's going to have all the muck that was mixed on the plate to begin with. And I think that's a, kind of a beautiful start to a layer. And then I'm going to have all that left over, which absolutely don't want to get rid of. Not at all. So let's do something a little different. We're going to go back to a stencil. I'm going to just layer over this one again. And I'm going to lay it down on all of that. If you don't have any of that, because your plate is clean by your last pull, don't stress. This is just a little extra. I'm going to put a layer of paint first and then lay that on. I'm going to layer this out. Paint's a little wet, that first layer, so it is mixing a little bit, but I'm good with that. We're going to layer this down, and you need to reach for your baby wipes. And if you don't have a baby wipe, just a wet cloth or a wet paper towel. And we're going to do a subtractive technique where we are going to eat away at the paint that's there. You can be very pristine and get rid of all of it, or you can be a little looser and just make it a little bit distressed. Your choice. I'm going to kind of do both so we see the effect. I will often, because if you're using a fresh baby wipe, it's pretty soapy and wet, I might just tap a little bit and get out the excess. I'm going to pull this, and I'm going to be left with that. And now I'm going to take a dark color, and I'm going to layer it one more time over. Every color I'm using right now is opaque, but you can absolutely do this with translucent colors as well. It's going to give you a different effect. Very often when I'm deciding about opaque or translucent, when I start with these kind of layers, I will usually or more often use opaque. And then as I build over ones that are already designed, I begin to use more of the translucent, so I don't lose the design. Okay, now I'm using chalk paint. It dries quite quickly. If you're using paint that stays wet for longer, you do need to let these layers dry. Otherwise, you're going to get a little bit of bleed. And that's okay, but sometimes people don't want that. They want it to be what they actually want it to be. Imagine that. Okay, so now I'm going to pull that print. Let's see what we get. Before I pull it up, remember what I said about turning it over? So you can kind of get a sense of what it's going to look like. Kind of. So that's what I have. Some areas are more defined because I pulled out all the paint with the baby wipe, and then some of them are kind of distressed and a little bit mucky. So it is a little bit of a different effect. But again, a completely different approach to the stencils. Lots of people along the way have asked me questions about like, well, why are you even doing it on a gel plate? Like, why aren't you just putting the stencil on the piece of paper and working over it that way? And you certainly can, but I find that the effect you get from a pull, it's a completely different surface than when you put the paint on with a brayer or a brush on paper. It's just different. I'm liking that. I could spend 2 hours just talking about stencils, but we need to move on. And we're going to move on to foam stamps. I've been using the foam stamps mostly from Robin McClendon because just her patterns and designs just really groove with me. Foam stamps are great to use on a plate because foam stamps take acrylic paint so well. I do not use acrylic paint on my rubber stamps because I don't like to clean and I don't like to clean fast. And I never think to have the foresight of having like a bucket of water to throw the stamps in. So I just don't use paint, but I love to use paint on these, which I don't clean even though I'm supposed to. So the two ways that I use these, really so simple. I'm going to grab some paint. And I'm just going to put just a touch on. Normally I would do this on a palette. And I might actually see that I need to do it on a palette. Yeah, maybe I can make it work. Yeah, I can make it work. But normally you pour the paint on a palette, run your brayer over it. So I'm going to do that. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to place a pattern here somewhere. Now I know you may or may not have foam stamps. I didn't want to add foam stamps, yet another ingredient that somebody might felt like they had to have. So if you have them, use them. If you don't, see what you think. Now, again, if I had foresight and you think I would have had that for a class, I would have had a little bucket of water, but you really don't want your acrylic paint to dry on your foam stamps. So what you can do, you can wipe it off, or you can just have a wet paper towel, a wet baby wipe, and just keep it wet until you have time to dry them. All right, technique number 2. Rather than use the stamp as a stamp, which is an additive technique, you know, we're adding, we're going to use it for a subtractive technique, and we're going to pull away. So I'm going to use a different color. I'm going to use some of this. This is translucent, but I love these two colors together. Sort of a limey green and kind of a lavender purplish. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put not too much because I'm only going to cover part of my plate. And I'm going to roll it out. And put just a touch more. Roll it out. And then I'm also going to put a little bit up here. I'm going to try to do it a little organically. And then I'm going to go ahead. Use that extra. And I'm going to use this to deboss, which is just to pull the design out. Hoping you can see that. Yeah, there you can see that better. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Maybe I'll do that. Now, I also have a little bit of that paint on here now. So I'm going to do a little embossing, just so it's a little bit more integrated and natural. So I'm pulling it off. It's going to leave a little bit on here. I'm going to add it to the other sections. I am going to let that dry. Now, again, for me, the chalk paints means that it dries really, really fast. Which is also one of the reasons why I love them, because I do not like to wait. You've heard me say probably I'm a very patient person, but I am such an impatient artist. I do not want to wait between layers. I just want to work. And I don't want to take the time to even take out a heat tool. So I just want to work. So this is probably not quite ready, but close to being ready. So, always be sure it's ready, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it anyway. I'm going to add my heavy cream, and I'm going to get a black. See if I have the right size there. Yeah, a black cardstock to pull from. By the by, choosing black or white as my substrate, mostly I think in all the work I do in contrasts. So if I'm adding as my pull layer a light color, I will pull it on a dark background. If I'm adding, say, a black or a dark, deep blue, I will pull it on a light background. So I have alternating dark and light in the layers. Gonna go ahead over this. I'm really liking what's happening with these. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull. And I'm really going to try to get a good pull on this. I don't mind if a little bit of the black shows through. In fact, I hope it does. But I want it to be a 6 by 6 inch full-on completed background that I could work over without losing the design that I made. Do I have any idea how this is going to come out? Barely. All right, let's see. Are we ready to pull? I always say I love a good reveal. And with a jelly plate, you get a reveal every time you pull. Yum. Okay. So I am really digging that. It has a little bit of black coming through. It has the designs. It's kind of pretty well integrated because I added the colors in both sections. It's got the gorgeous, bright, vivid blue lagoon on the edges, which I think is pretty cool. I'm liking that. I think that's a really good start. So that, my friends, is your foam stamp lesson of the day. I'm getting another baby wipe, covering that. I'm just going to add it. And these are just going to sit here till I can clean them later. All right, I want to show you a technique that I don't use very often, but I think it's a fun one. I'm hoping it's not one that everyone's done. And I'm going to call it a rubber stamp mask. A rubber stamp mask. So you can choose any stamp for this, but a stamp with very defined edges is just easier. You don't always have to make it easier, but it's just easier. So I'm just going to use a round stamp because that's very defined and easily cut. I am going to put it on a block. You don't have to. So if you have a block and you're following along, I know I didn't warn you that the stamps were coming, but you can grab a stamp. And you're going to then get two things. You're going to get an ink pad. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have my ink. I'm going to have my substrate. And I'm going to have, and this is what you probably don't have in front of you, but you probably have near you, a Post-it. It's easy to make a mask with a Post-it because it has the stick that is not permanent. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ink my stamp. I'm not inking the gel plate. I'm inking the Post-it. Let's even move the gel plate for a minute. And I'm going to try to get a pretty good impression. And that's my impression. And in fact, just because I want to have this in the design, I'm going to do it twice. Okay. Now I'm going to get my substrate. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use the same stamp to make a design. And I don't know, I guess we could be a little fancy. Takes a little more thinking, but let's do it off the edge like that. All right, another ingredient that's not on the list, but I think you probably all have is a pair of scissors. I am not going to cut my substrate, but I am going to cut the circle out of the Post-it because that circle is going to serve as a mask. I don't have to be perfect with my cutting. I know I'm not going to be. I'm just going to try to get that. Now, hopefully, there's a little bit of the stick on it because you do need it to stick. There are some Post-its out there in the world that are full stick. You know, the entire back is sticky, but it's repositionable. And if you're going to use a mask technique, this one or any other one, it is a phenomenal tool to have. It's you know, Post-its aren't that expensive. It's worth the investment. You can get one that's a little larger. So I have this here. I'm going to be able to line it up. And I'm going to then take my cut circle and I'm going to place it over my uncut circle. The one that's on, whoops, on there, on my substrate. And this one, I'm going to do the same thing, but I need to kind of match it up since I am not using the whole circle. And then I don't have to get rid of this, but I am because I'm afraid I might pull it off inadvertently as I work. So I think it's pretty clear what I have here. I got two circles from a stamp masked on a piece of paper. Now I'm going to get my jelly plate. I'm definitely going back to acrylics. And I'm going to, I don't know, let's use that color again. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to layer out this color. And just for fun, because I can, and it's a little bit more interesting, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get a stencil. And I'm going to just pull up a little bit, just so it's a little bit more interesting. Because that's easy to do, and why not? You know, that takes all of 7 seconds. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull a print. I'm just going to make sure that the masks don't fall off. Now, this is simple, what I have here. You can do this on something that's extremely detailed and has lots of layers. But for the purposes of just showing this technique, we don't need that much. All right, so what's going to happen? I think you guys probably know. You are going to pull it up. The masks are going to stick. And you're going to end up having a pristine area underneath the masks. And I actually really like the irregularity of the background from the stencil. So I now have these. And of course, since we save everything, you know, this is obviously going to be a collage bit. And in fact, it might even be fun if that's the style to even collage them on. But my goal now is, now that I have this pristine background, is I can take watercolors, I can take pencils, and I can go ahead and I can paint those out. And I have that pure area. Also, you know, maybe I would paint out the inner circle, the outer circle, the concentric circles, and maybe leave that for something else, maybe cut it out, maybe use it as an embellishment, maybe journal in it. So it's just a different way to use masks. And it's always important to remember that when you mask something out, it gives you a completely different look and feel. So easy. All right, we are going to take our break. And then we're going to come back. We're going to go through the dye sprays, the ink pads, and watercolors, and then move on to creating our art piece.